My name is Rebecca Dufendach, and it is my pleasure to introduce Pablo Gómez, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose work examines the history of health and corporality in the early modern world. His book, The Experiential Caribbean, Creating Knowledge and Healing in the Early Modern Atlantic, explores belief-making, and the creation of evidence around the human body and the natural world. He is currently working on a history of the quantifiable body and the development of novel ideas about risk, labor, and disease that appeared in Atlantic slave markets. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. And somebody else, I am very, very grateful to Daniela, to Kim for the invitation, and to Amy and Chelsea for making these happen. Thank you also to the Getty and to MC and all the other institutions that made this wonderful conference possible. It's really an honor. I've been having a blast and enjoying very much the presentations. And this was not planned, but I think my talk, I hope, kind of continues part of the conversation that we had in the last panel. So, and let me actually follow Daniel's example and just make sure that I have a timer here. So when I first received the invitation, I had to think hard about how to insert my work on histories of knowledge production in the 17th century Caribbean into a history of indigenous knowledge in the making of colonial Latin America that, as we were talking yesterday, did not depend on the usual trappings of encounter, catastrophe, and erasure. And I say this because scholars have mostly defined the Caribbean as a historical space on the basis of precisely the disappearance of indigenous populations. I mean, this is after the 16th century. The Caribbean has functioned as a sort of a tabula rasa, one that could be reimagined and reinvented, both historically and historiographically, for the analysis of commodity and wealth production, or for the discussion of African cultural and social continuities and their creolization. The history of the Caribbean has also had profound consequences for historical ideations of labor, capitalism, migration, societal organization in the modern world, and even, some say, for the conceptualization of postmodern epistemologies of individuality. Even more, colonialism in its modern iteration, some scholars argue, was also born in the Caribbean. The recognition of the Caribbean as a place of birth of multiple modernities also reveals, I think, how we, Euro-American scholars, have tended to ally its presence in the making of our own modern histories and modeling analytical structures. And this is just getting specifically to the topics of this conference. I think that partially what the history of that Amerindian Caribbean of the 17th century teaches is that traditional ethnohistoric or Marxist economic analysis or Durkheimian social science tenets seem to be inadequate to examine the processes of knowledge-making, of power creation in times of social creativity, to borrow from Latour here, who was already invoked. This is that there is something specific and particular about moments of crisis that is critical in defining how instances of power and value creation emerge. And this is what we were talking about right before. And that examination of the contours of, in the case of my own work, bodily practices can reveal. So what I will share with you today comes from one of my new projects in which, together with several other scholars, we're trying to look for methodological interventions that go beyond the so-called and problematic global turn in histories of science and knowledge-making and histories of medicine, and to search for interventions and language, again, something that we have been talking about here, that go beyond the usual anthropologization and otherization of non-Euro-American producers of knowledge about nature. And today I want to focus on one of those tropes, and one that I believe is integrally inserted in the historicist origins of ethnohistories, and which has had profound consequences for the ideations of histories of knowledge-making about nature in early modern and modern Europe, and by extension in Euro-American academia emerging from precisely the 16th and 17th century. And to it, this is what I'll be arguing, is that the fictitious ex nihilo nature of the Caribbean depended fundamentally on historicism's need to have a newly defined ontological other as a point of reference, one that disappeared from the region, but whose otherness, as defined in the new divides between nature and culture of the era, remained pervasively in the historical and narrative imagination to define Amerindians and non-Europeans elsewhere. The disappearance of the Amerindians as a meaningful active historical actor in the history of the post-16th century Caribbean, in these fictitious narratives that I just recall, has to do with this crucial positioning within processes of epistemological justification about claims for the description of the world that depended precisely on the seclusion and portrayal of others' ontology as fundamentally different from the nascent scientific, quote-unquote, modern, and also, by the way, fictitious and problematic West, category of the West. And that's something that people like Johannes Fabian, Deepesh Chakrabarty has been arguing already for decades. Caribbean Amerindians and their descendants, as I hope I don't need to remind you, obviously did not disappear after the 16th century, even if they constituted a definitive minority in the reconfigured urban and rural spaces that eventually emerged in the region and appear mostly in the periphery of surviving historical works. They became crucial actors in the historical transformations that occur in the region, but they were not pristine Taino Arawak or Zenu or Caribe Guarapi cultures, as we have also been talking about here. What is crucial to recognize is that by the mid-17th century, Caribbean Amerindian communities' circumstances were defined by the same instability and flux that those of many other Atlantic actors arriving in the region. Caribbean Amerindians' existence and historical actions were marked by multiple migrations, cultural and social dislocation, and a continuous rebuilding of multicultural communities. The rest of my time, I want to talk about how those histories can be useful spaces to think about larger narratives and about not only in the Caribbean, but more largely early modern histories of knowledge making. I believe that this approach can make us rethink the categories that we use to talk about these histories of knowledge making, the issues with most theoretical approaches to the topic, and the manifold assumptions behind them. And I have a proposal drawing from a lot of work that has been done on theories of value and the new materialism for examining these histories that depart from a focus on, again, a materialism methodology that focuses on value creation. At least partially, as historians and anthropologists have recognized, one of the issues with existing challenges to the homogeneity of Western historicism is that they are built on metaphysical spaces born of the same historical process that they aim to disentangle. And just to remind you, and this is again what's invoked just a couple of minutes ago, they depart from the idea of a historicity that was based on the stability of the idea of an universal nature, as famously argued by Gilles Deleuze, and more recently by the perspectivists Descola and Viveros de Castro, more famously with the radical alterity. This, of course, has to do with the fact that it was the construction of a dualist ontology in the 17th century that made epistemological commitments to separate nature and humans and nature and culture, Europeans and the others. What gave shape not only to the intellectual construction of modernity and its isms, but also the seemingly inescapable empirical boundaries of processes of historical reconstruction. And let me enumerate three, these are not all, but three related strategies that are meaningful, I think, for what we have been discussing here, and that scholars have used to talk about Amerindian histories of knowledge making related, and specifically, in my case, to nature and bodies. So first, they have done so through a recognition of a generalizable and inscrutable otherness. This is by referring to ontologies that are inaccessible and that can only be inelegantly transcribed with our own limited terminology. This is also that is repeated also in perspectivist accounts to a certain extent. Second, through the crafting of histories focused on semiotics, either of origin or mestizaje or hybridity, usually localized and organized around structuralist historical linguistics and material cultural practices that intend to recreate words or knowledge that we can then locate within specific analytical models that are also coming, we have to remember, from Euro-American categories. And I can say more about this in the Q&A. Third, or more recently, and eschewing the tried ivories of yesteryear, as we also talk, through a study of how Europeans and Amerindian and Africans and their descendants became entangled. And this is a word that also was mentioned in the discussion before, and it's something that Marcy Norton and Ralph Auer had been promoting, including in a great specialist of the Colonial Latin American School of Review, edited by my friend Chris Lane here. And we can talk also about the issues of entanglement as a category that also thinks and recognizes technologies, medicinal substances, and technology within specific recognizable boundaries. And again, to repeat, to put it bluntly, these methodologies depend on the ideation, and this is important, of an analytical space where we can look at the relationality, this is what we're looking at, between those distinctly identifiable traditions, including not only those of Amerindian and Africans, but also, again, those labeled problematically and universally as European, modern, or scientific. In other words, our cultural, social histories and ethnohistories also paradoxically depend on the redefining of categories of fictitious cultural spaces and structures created precisely in European academy, and the insistence of the homogenization of belief and commitment to the solidity of vaguely defined Indigenous and European worldviews and epistemologies. Take, for instance, a report that Bartolomé Polo, a Jesuit living in the Kingdom of Granada, sent to Rome in 1656. In the report, Polo discussing very well-known tropes of the discovery of wondrous things by Europeans in the New World, of the natural tool and of the natural tools that the communities in which he lived promoted, including antidotes for all types of potions, technologies for the creation of candles, textiles, and a fruit that was not only the main staple of birds and rodent, but also a wonderful medicine for tumors and colds, which he had personally experienced. In Polo's account, we can see the origins of larger narratives in which an already large scholarship has invested much energy with powerful results. Amerindians figures in these accounts and in many other historical works as collectors of information about botanicals, animals, and spiritual forces, both for their own projects or for the projects of colonial agents. They are also the inventors of useful technologies to be inscribed either in modern models of productivity and natural resources and their exploitation, or for their own cultural purposes. And there is indeed good evidence for this. As in other Atlantic locales, 17th century European Caribbean physicians and surgeons resorted to the knowledge of Amerindian communities had about the natural world and incorporated it in their own treatments. In his treatise on surgery, first published in Spain in 1628, for example, the famous Cartagenero surgeon Pedro López de León wrote about the effectiveness of local Caribbean treatments for social ills that materialize in bundles of disease. López de León, that a substance used by Amerindian ritual practitioners in the northern New Kingdom of Granada around the city of Santa Marta, quote, make the sick person expel the curse through his mouth and intestines little by little. I myself have seen how some people, after using the remedy, throw out little bones of toads through their mouths. Amerindian practitioners also appear in the judicial record of early modern Cartagena and the Caribbean and provide powerful testimony to the knowledge of the New World and its land and secrets. Some of them were well-renowned, including one named Hillard, who Jesuit priests said lived in the town of Tubará and was famous across all the land. In Inquisition, testimonies related to Black Caribbean ritual practitioners, Caribbean people of all origins recognized that Indios herbolarios were masters of the same natural world inhabited by spiritual entities and energies of a social nature identified by both them and their African and Afro-descendant counterparts. Moreover, as I explore in my first book, ritual practitioners of African descent, many of them African, repeatedly reported to the Inquisition and judicial authorities about their exchanges of information with their Amerindian counterparts. And here we're looking obviously at a different kind of encounter, not only between Europeans and Amerindians, but also between those others of the New World, African and their descendants. Such processes of exchange were even more pronounced, not only in the main cities like Cartagena, Havana, but also in the constellation of Marul settlements populated by cosmopolitan communities of African Creoles, Spaniards, and Amerindias that proliferated in the regions in places like La Maria, El Limón, in the Kingdom of Granada, or in Panama, Nicaragua, or around Santiago de Cuba, or in the mountains of Jamaica. And let me see if I can. This is a description of some of those spaces in the northern Kingdom of Granada. Some of these are both Amerindian and villas populated mainly by people of African descent. Okay. We know thus of the ubiquity of spaces for exchange information, and historians have talked about this hybrid and mestizo knowledge, and as I said before, entangled knowledges. We have also worked hard to examine the words of the others in the Atlantic and in colonial Latin America, as we have been discussing. But I believe that there is more to these histories. If we can approach them with the recognition of reality, thinking about reality, of precisely that we cannot know. An argument that I have already made previously in my work. There are, after all, aspects of the world that remain the same even if ritual practitioners, priests, or scientists, or for that matter, humans of any sort, were to disappear. To cite Dan Graeber, it is not the perspective that is transcendental that will be indeed a true contradiction of terms, but the most fundamental aspects of reality in the classic set of transcendental as something which can have effect on us, but we, on the contrary, cannot affect. In Polo's report, for instance, we also learn about the discombobulated overwhelming of the senses that occurred to Europeans in the New World. In it, Polo announces the existence of an implausible, from our naturalistic point of view, creature. And he says, quote, "When the skies are serene and the sun burning, some small snakes or serpents with about a square thumb's width and a quarter in length fall from the region of the air. These snakes plunge to the earth in areas far away from mountains, so it cannot be suspected that the snakes fly from them. They have a scamus silvery skin and no extremities, and on both of their little bodies head with very delicate little thorns. They do not have any type of eyes or eyebrows from which it can be deducted that they are of the nature of topos del aire, air moles. They are extremely poisonous. A female Indian, upon bitten by these snakes, bled through eyes, ear, nose, and mouth." So where do we locate these moles? For what purpose do they emerge in the history of Polo and knowledge making about nature? One readily available answer is to explain them as a mode of either natural historical account of monstrosity or to link it to Amerindian traditions, in this case of Zenu groups. This is if one takes Polo's narratives at face value and makes assumptions about the tradition in which he is inscribing his experiences or from which he is drawing them. This approach brings to the front the assumption I mentioned before. This is that there are largely identified traditions that we can resort to explain the actions of our historical characters. Another productive avenue for examining these events is instead to focus on the sensorial and experiential histories of knowledge making. And again, as I have done previously in my own research. In this case, flying moles wondrously colonizing the lived experience of Polo and his fellow Jesuits. And these methodologies that I think are very productive allow us to see how Caribbean Amerindian technologies and cultures like hammock and canoes model sensorially and cognitively early conquistadores like Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, as Martin Norton argues in her new research. Experience, indeed, became a central aspect of most of the reports coming from the New World to Europe. The experiential offers fruitful avenues for complicating seemingly well-known histories and spaces of creativity and exchange. This approach focuses on instances of precisely what is the value of what our actors are doing. So the moles, rather than being committed descriptors or an unmovable reality, functions as tools for the creations of systems of value that determine the possibilities for social and cultural exchange. By zeroing in value creation, we can focus on the contradictory ways in which historical actors deploy seemingly homogeneous traditions and emphasizes and focuses on the purposes and actions in which they engage. And this is important. This type of analysis also makes clear that it's the creation of the tools for engaging the war, these power objects of both European Amerindians and Africans, what actually shapes social relationships, including acceptable strategies for establishment of matters of truth. So, for instance, the question is not what are the biomedical bases for the function or ethnographic origins or the antidotes or medicinal substances that Pablo and myriad of other reports, and this is something that we have also been discussing here, describe in their works. It assumes that all actors in the history believe on them, or as if biomedicine actually gives us final answers for their functions. Kind of, they justify them. And here, so the previous example was coming from a collection of recipes that Jesuits brought from all over the Atlantic in the 18th century. And this is from my own work, a collection of medicinal substances that come from the early modern Caribbean, and specifically from the new part of the New Kingdom of Granada and Cuba. Most of them used by ritual specialists of African descent that, as I said before, are actively and they're forthcoming in saying that they're learning these medicinal substances from their from Amerindians that populated the region. So I guess the question for me, and this is also something that relates to this idea of boundary objects or strategic objects, as I call them in my own work, as what occurs in the process of creation of the medicinal substances to combat the effects of air mold in the case of Bartolomé Polo. How do they shape life in Sinu communities? What was at stake for these historical actors, and how can we think about them participants in processes that care little about the epistemological spaces in which they are deployed, but rather in the concrete ways in which we theorize how they live? There is much more to say about this, but because of time, let me focus on one thing, on the fact that people in the Caribbean were, precisely because of their own dislocated circumstances, particularly suspicious about claims that experts had about the war and its working. This is, they care little for claims about ontology. And something that I have argued elsewhere, but I can think can help us to focus on the grappling with those matters of ritual and epistemological promiscuity. Some of these experts that people were so suspicious for were people like Guaquerias ritual practitioners from the Caribbean part of the province of Cumaná, in what today is Venezuela. The Capuchin missionaries called Piaches. So these Capuchin missionaries, right in the second half of the 17th century, wrote that these Piaches were physicians, astrologers, and necromancers, and greatly esteemed by Indians who venerated them and called them from all matters of curing. The Piaches, the Capuchinos reported, are usually the more astute and Ladinos. They deceive their fellow Indians with 1,000 tricks. It took some time to become a Piache. The Piaches had to have their signal masters, instruct them, and the process was brutal. The process of instruction took about 6 months, where in addition to starvation, isolation, and intoxication with various hallucinogenics, Piaches were tortured with cuts and with little knives, navajitas, and tied to be stung by fire ants. So I don't know if it was a very good profession to be. Okay. Okay. Not even with the glasses I can see the... After the Piaches returned to their communities, where they had to compete with other practitioners, they would become, if successful, very feared and venerated in what was literally a cutthroat competition. The Capuchins said that Caribe Cumana Indians will pay for every visit the Piaches made to the sick people, and during the duration of the disease, their patients provide them with food and drinks, and blow over them and make over them the gestures and superstitions that they usually do. I'm going to cut over this part of the talk. But what I want to point out here is that there are several things that emerge that are common to both missionary reports and to testimonies that hundreds of patients gave about ritual practitioners of all stripes in the 17th century Caribbean in this history of the Piaches. And I want to underscore a couple of them. So first, that the most successful practitioners were those that were more attuned to other cultures and their languages. Hence the remark on the PHSN that the most successful were the Ladinos. Second, the creation of a belief, but also of deception and failure as central themes of their lives. And crucially, as I said before, the ubiquity of payment and search for material rewards of both practitioners and the communities around them. So extant records also allow glimpses into the lives of many other health specialists who joined those PHs in competing for authority over bodily matters in the Caribbean. They all hustle for clients and cures, and among them we also have contemporary Europeans that we label as licensed physicians, apothecaries, barber surgeons, midwives, bloodletters, coppers, midwives, herbalists, and other specialists. The majority of them were of African origin. Black Caribbean ritual specialists on felt experiences during encounters with Amerindian groups was thus to be expected, given that they typically spoke no Native American languages, and in many cases not even Castilian. Language discordances were the norm in most Amerindian areas of the Caribbean shores in South America by the 17th century. When explaining the animosities between different groups in the Indian town of Chenú, located east of Cartagena, Fray Diego Becerra wrote in 1612, quote, that there are constant brawls and fights between the Indians because they are from different tongues and people without reason and other common trouble. In this Babylonian world, where material culture, rights, and even body movements were unrecognizable as universal signifiers, experiences often provided the only tool for diagnosing and dissecting social and cultural scenarios. And such was the case when African ritual practitioners like Francisco Mandinga or Antonio Congo went around successfully curing Native Americans in different Indian towns in the savannas of the northern kingdom of Granada, summoned by caciques and encomenderos. Moreover, the promiscuity of Caribbean patients in their use of health practitioners also demonstrate a lack of a necessary ontological commitment among all these communities. This in turn leads to a crucial point. Can we conceive that a Wakari would object to the statement that the Piache does not really have the power to contract the ancestor that he's claiming he is summoning in his rituals, practices? And the answer for me, we don't know this answer, but the answer for me will be an obvious yes. Caribbean Amerindians, and more generally inhabitants of all tribes in the Atlantic, say things like this all the time, and yet they moved on. They were committed to these epistemologies. They believe in what they could feel and live with the contradictions of claiming adherence to certain life worlds, while distrusting fundamentally its tenets and proselytizers. And that, of course, include Europeans and their health practitioners and fetishes, Hippocratic medicines, crucifixes, surgical apparatuses, or scientists, natural philosophers, natural historians with their microscopes and books. And additionally, the insistence of historical actors in the fact that belief was essential for the curative powers of practices is also a given. But, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, belief in the Caribbean was not certainly taken for granted. It was fought for, and it was the currency of these practitioners that I'm talking about, both in the supposedly homogeneous communities of Amerindians in Cumaná and in cosmopolitan spaces like Havana or San Juan. People did not understand necessarily, nor they had any sometimes interest in doing so, what were the epistemes around the practices of which they were object. Such recognition, I believe, allows to reposition historical actors, such as 17th century Piaches and Africa's Mohanes like Congo and Mandinga, as effectual agents on a materiality from which they had been exiled in most existing historical narratives. It permits us to see them not only as a cultural agents or as reacted to said materiality, but rather as rightful innovators and shaper of its real, in the sense that I'm talking about here, contours. Defining how the work can be felt and arguing about its value, after all, makes fundamental claims about its nature. It theorizes the work. But it also makes emphasis on the inherent instability of processes of social creativity or epistemic hierarchies, their political character, and the commonality of doubt, pain, and cheating and unsavory practices. Taking seriously our historical actors and the sources from which we depend also requires us to recognize the contested and fragmenting nature of belief and a right deception as a tool for modeling of power. Let me finish here. Practices around disease and healing, precisely because they are pervasive, and it is not an accident that we have been talking about medicine so much during the past 2 days. Precisely because of these, they offer possibilities for the deployment of recognizable repertoires of cultural tools. And they have become commonplaces of ethnohistories and of ethnographies of all sorts. Yet I think that historians, anthropologists, and literary scholars are very particular about the specific aspects of those medicinal practices, material culture, and beliefs that we like to underscore. And this is here where I think the histories of the tumultuous Caribbean, the fractured Caribbean, offer alternative ways to problematize assumptions about the life worlds of early modern Amerindians and Europeans and Africans. We do not need to portray these practices in terms of the radical alternatives that we cannot even put into our own analytical terms in accessible realities that will only exist for particular groups. Nor do we need to seclude them in structurally groupable forms of human existence, as perspectivists do. The history of early modern Caribbean Amerindians and African practitioners can teach us something unexpected about early modern practice of knowledge-making, and not only about those Ospiaches or Congo Baganga, but also about Western natural philosophers, missionaries, and shamans. It is crucial, and in this I'm drawing from the work of people like Martin Holbrook, Fowles, and Dan Graeber, to remove a methodological model that paradoxically reifies others and historicism as essential. It is true that a recognition of ontological alterity protects us from the arrogance of thinking that the people that we study are silly when they say and do things that seems to us as irrational. But this is the key thing. It also protects us the incomplete and very contested nature of our own beliefs, of science, of our biomedicine, and our common sense, as Holbrook will say. And crucially, of the historicist structures of authority that we can refer to as Western science or Western history, or the categories that anthropologists use. Such a process is certainly an imperfect and uncomfortable bridging tool in a sort of frenetic Aristotelian manner that allows us to act in an also imperfect world, a manner of, to quote, how do I say, staying with the trouble. It is easy to dismiss these claims as estrident, yet by ignoring them, we risk being willfully blind to the very material processes that drove the production of the type of knowledge and practices in which we are interested. I think these are calls to make these histories, these studies richer and empirically sounder. In other words, I don't believe that our project should identify plural versions of the practice of writing histories of knowledge making or alternative science or of the biomedical origins of herbal medicine. Instead, I believe that we need to continue providing a new language to speak of histories of intellectual and material engagement with the natural world that go beyond a recognition of others and alterity. Following Ellen Veran, I think we should fully embrace the challenging task of doing difference together. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Pablo. Next, it is my honor to introduce Martha Few, who is a professor of colonial Latin American history at Pennsylvania State University. Her recent books include For All of Humanity, Mesoamerican and Colonial Medicine in Enlightenment Guatemala, and Centering Animals in Latin America with Zeb Tortorici. Professor Few is also a senior editor of the journal Hispanic American Historical Review. Today's talk comes from the research for her new book in progress, Insects and the Making of the New World. Please welcome Martha Few.
Thank you, Rebecca. I also just want to echo my thanks to everybody who helped make this possible, and also to the audience for being here as well. And let me get this going. There we go. In 1804, alarming reports filtered in from tributary Maya farmers to political officials in Rabinal, located in the province of Verapaz in what is now northern highland Guatemala. So I'll give you a map of what colonial Central America looks like that's known as the Audiencia of Guatemala. These Maya farmers had discovered 2 large patches of what is called chapulín saltón. This is a local term for locust in their milpas, traditional agricultural fields of maize, beans, and squash, the staple crops of Mesoamerican diets. From our 21st century perspective, it might be hard to imagine the threat that these patches posed, even though colonial observers labeled the insects chapulín saltón, that is, grasshoppers at the jumping stage who were not yet able to fly. If left unchecked, they would begin to physically transform and then swarm into immense clouds of flying locusts, bringing with them the very real threat of widespread famine and disease. Modern entomological studies show that these so-called locust plagues can reach sizes of up to 400 square miles, can contain some several billion insects, and travel as far as 3,000 miles from their point of origin. The archival record shows countless examples of huge locust clouds that could and did travel together across the southern part of colonial Mesoamerica, from Oaxaca through Chiapas and Guatemala and into El Salvador and Honduras, as the insects flew, landed, and flew again, eating their way through domestic staple crops as well as lucrative export crops. Thomas Gage, who was an English Dominican priest who traveled through the region in the 17th century, chronicled what it felt like to be caught up in the midst of such a swarm. He wrote, "The highways were so covered with locusts that they startled the traveling mules with their fluttering about their heads and feet. My eyes were often struck with their wings as I rode along, and much ado that I had to see my way, what with a montero, which is a type of hunting cap, wherewith I was fain to cover my face, what with the flight of them, which were still before my eyes." Gage continued apocalyptically, quote, "They, the locusts, did fly about in number so thick and infinite that they did truly cover the face of the sun and hinder the shining forth of the beams of this bright planet." Back in Verapaz, according to authorities, quote, "There was some doubt that the insects that had been spotted were indeed chapulín," end quote. Colonial officials decided to send a locally known locust killing expert, a Ladino man named Jose Garcia, to the town of Cubulco, located close to the infested fields. There he put together a workforce of some 50 Quiche Maya men who, under his direction, would do the actual locust killing. Garcia and the workforce first traveled to the sites to observe the insects in situ to determine whether or not the infestations were actually chapulín. In locust killing campaigns like this one, colonial officials drew on a tributary labor system, a forced labor system that organized indigenous workers at the town level. Workers exterminated the locusts with the available extermination technologies: fire to burn the insects, agricultural tools to crush and bury them, and the release of domestic animals, especially pigs, to dig up and eat or trample any remaining chapulín egg sacs. At both of the sites, Garcia judged that the insects were indeed chapulín and ordered the men to kill them. The Cubulco workers, however, disagreed with Garcia's assessment and argued that he had misidentified the locusts. When Garcia insisted that they were indeed locusts and again ordered the men to kill the insects, the workers rebelled and they used the verb atumultar. Led by the town's Quiche Maya indigenous elders and political leaders, the group restrained Garcia, removed his sheepskin jacket, and whipped him. They then tied him up and brought him back to Cubulco, where they presented him to the local judge, amid much shouting and threats. The elders who led the group told the judge that the insects were not locusts, and in their frustration, they had punished Garcia because their time had been uselessly spent killing the insects that were not a threat. And apparently this had happened before. My talk today analyzes what I call the politics of indigenous knowledge by juxtaposing this and other archival examples of indigenous knowledge claims about locust swarms and their interactions with regional landscapes and local ecologies by colonial scientists and physicians, lay people, locust killing experts known as peritos, political authorities, and native peoples themselves. I use these sources to begin to think about how to answer these questions and so working through some of this. What methodologies and approaches allow us to uncover and trace indigenous knowledges in archival sources? What did indigenous knowledge mean to colonial peoples? What made some indigenous knowledge claims about insects and their interactions with humans, plants, and colonial landscapes, how to identify them, how to kill them, or how to simply live with them, more helpful or trustworthy, or suspect and discountable than others, and why? This conflict over what was and was not a locust took place amid the shift to increasingly uniform state-directed insect extermination campaigns that emerged over the course of the long 18th century. A new kind of exterminator, like Garcia, led the campaigns. These generally tended to be either Spanish men or, in more remote areas like Verapaz, Hispanicized bilingual indigenous men who had lived in agriculturally productive areas with large indigenous populations and who were seen as having a particular experience and skill at identifying and killing locusts. The goal of these new state-directed regional campaigns was to exterminate locusts and clear them from colonial Central America and southern Mexico to ensure the continued success of Spanish colonization there, especially the colony's model of economic development, and to simultaneously ensure the survival of colonial peoples, especially tributary Indians, the mainstay of the colonial labor force. Locusts enter the archival record pretty much only when they swarm and present all sorts of dangers to humans and colonial society. When additionally we integrate into our analysis indigenous sources such as codices, annals, histories, and other accounts, as well as apply ethnohistorical analyses that can locate indigenous perspectives in colonial sources, we see a range of human relationships with insects, and things begin to open up. By attending to indigenous and local knowledges and directing our attention to evidence of non-Western thinking about animals and insects, we can begin to explore competing ideas of categories of animals and humans and their strategic deployment in certain contexts. We chart the change over space and time of indigenous, European, African, local, and other cultural practices of human interactions with insects, plants, and local ecosystems, cultural practices and knowledges that are always relational. So when colonial peoples use the term locust to describe swarming, devouring insects of colonial Mesoamerica, what exactly do they mean? The example of the conflict over what was and what was not a locust that opened this talk points to the importance of this issue. Modern entomology classifies all locusts as grasshoppers, but not all grasshoppers as locusts. Some dozen species of grasshoppers have the ability to swarm into locust plagues. This occurs in response to a drought when the insects crowd around remaining food sources and rub up against each other in the process. This causes a change called locust phase polyphenism. Basically what happens is as the locusts begin to swarm and their legs begin to rub up against each other, their bodies begin to physically transform. Their wings become bigger, their legs become stronger, and their colors begin to change. Archival sources from the colonial period show two terms primarily used for locust, langosta and chapulín, and I've been using these interchangeably today, reflecting both Old World and New World experiences with this insect before European colonization of the Americas. The Spanish term langosta, from the Latin locusta, was one of the words used to describe this insect in Europe and the Americas in the colonial period as part of swarms, or that had the potential at a later stage of development to join with others and swarm. Locusts have long figured in the imagination of various cultures as an important and potentially ominous species well before the arrival of the Spanish to the New World. Islamic cultures, for example, attribute important roles to insects, including locusts, as part of their sacred texts. Judeo-Christian cultures also give locusts prominent roles in their sacred history. The Old Testament is filled with references to locust plagues, such as the plague visited upon Egypt when the Pharaoh refused to free the Israelites, referred to in Exodus. The New Testament also contains references to locusts as literal harbingers of the apocalypse. Inhabitants in colonial Guatemala and elsewhere in New Spain use the word chapulín in written sources to describe non-swarming grasshoppers and grasshoppers who, under certain conditions, swarm to become locust plagues. Chapulín comes from the Nahuatl word chapulín, literally destroyer by the mouth or devourer. Mesoamerican cultures also had their own memory of locust swarm that predated the arrival of Europeans. Place names important to Mesoamerican cultures, for example, incorporated these insects, such as the Nahuatl place name Chapultepec, that translates into English as Locust Hill, and which today we know as Chapultepec Park in Mexico City, for example. The Mesoamerican chapulín and the Spanish langosta were used interchangeably, so we see terms like langosta de chapulín, langosta que llaman chapulín, chapulín de langosta, to signify grasshoppers and locusts throughout the colonial period and even into the 21st century. A number of Mesoamerican codices reference Chapolin plagues and include them in their annals. The Codex Mexicanus, and I have an image of one of the pages here, is a Nahuatl language manuscript that dates to the late 16th century. It contains, among other things, calendric, genealogical, historical, and biblical information and images, and was authored by an anonymous Nahuatl speaker. The historical section is a kind of historical almanac and references the most important historical events on different dates, and it includes references to locust plagues. So here we have reference here. You can see here on the big screen, and this would be the dates going across here. We can see reference to a locust plague on 6 rabbit in the year of what we would know as 1466, and the Chapolin appears above the chronogram. And I'll give you a close-up right here of what it looks like. The Chapolin is located on top of what looks like a hill with a number of humans, at least 3, maybe 4 humans next to it. There are also some counting flags up above, which I'm not sure what it's counting exactly. I think those are consisting of like 20, I think, but I'm not sure what they're counting 20 of, or 100 in that case. So we can see that in this annal, this locust plague was important. But then let me go to show you the larger one again, and let me point your attention to this little sketch down here, which also, as you can see, looks like locusts. So if we go down here, this looks like, to me, I'm still working on the interpretation, but this looks like a sketch of a locust underground in what might be a locust egg sac, and then this little burrow where the locust is kind of coming out and emerging kind of fully formed as a Chapolin into the world and to begin its eating. So perhaps this image, my working theory is this image might represent the insect in the process inside an egg sac buried in the ground who's now emerged. I'll need to do more research to puzzle this meaning more definitively, but just the fact that these Chapolin plagues and these Chapolin images are here are significant because they are included in a historical section with other events critical to Mexica history, including the departure from their original homeland of Aztlan. Let me also show you an example from the Codex Obin, which is a set of Central Mexican annals of pre-Hispanic and colonial events, also represented by pictorial images and Nahuatl alphabetic writing. The account is also structured as in the Mesoamerican cycle of years with, again, the most important historical events depicted from about the 1100s through the early 17th century with the arrival of a new viceroy and the archbishop to Mexico City. Amid the significant events that this annal chronicles, including the founding of the Mexica capital of Tenochtitlan and the dynastic history of that city, we find 2 references to Chapolin invasions. We see this one here, on this side here. In this one, we see a Chapolin sort of emerging from the page, almost as if in process to go about eating this tasty plant right there. And then if we go one step further, we see on a few pages later, we see that the Chapolin has, here again noticing, these are roughly saying the Chapolin have descended, so the clouds have landed, and they're now eating another tasty plant. So together, the Codex Mexicanus and the Codex Obin provide some evidence that locust plagues were significant events in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican society, noteworthy enough that indigenous authors included them in their annals along with other important events. Building on this book, I want to bring up the Florentine Codex, which I know we've talked a lot about, and I'm showing you a few pages of a larger section on Chapolin from Book 11 called Natural Things, to provide further information about Mesoamerican knowledges of natural history in general, including insects and specifically Chapolin. Just a quick note about how it's structured. You may already know, but this side tends to be what is written in Spanish along with the images. The right-hand side is writing in Nahuatl, just to kind of orient you there. One of the things that Kevin Terracciano and others have noted is that, especially when reading the Florentine Codex, it's important that you take into consideration both the Spanish, the Nahuatl, and the images as relational. Don't consider them as a direct translation of each other. So in the interest of time today, I'm going to highlight a few takeaways takeaways related to thinking about the politics of indigenous knowledge in contrast to other knowledges or cultural understandings of locusts by comparing a few examples. So if we start, for example, with this section on the Spanish side, this paragraph here roughly says, and I'm drawing your attention to that because it roughly says in Spanish, there are many kinds of langostas in this land. They are like those found in Spain. So they're kind of grouping all these different chapulín together. There's some 9 different kinds that are listed here, but they're sort of glossing it over into one, these are just like what we see in Spain. However, if we look at the Nahuatl side here, we see much more detail about what makes different types of chapulín. That is, we have chapulín as a category, and then we have details inside. And so let me give you some examples. In the Nahuatl section, we know that, and for now I'll say I'm relying on the Dibble and Anderson translation as I work through it myself. We know that chapulín, for example, are united, according to the Nahuatl, by their body shape, parts, and spittle. So they write, the chapulín of whatever kind is straight with a slender abdomen with a stubby head. It has spittle, it has saliva, it has wings, arms, and legs. You also have the Nahuatl noting that they are united by the way that they reproduce. And I'm quoting, and as to its nature, its manner of life, it reproduces underground, it lays eggs underground, there it deposits its eggs. And there they hatch. When they come forth, they are already like small chapulín. And then finally, the third element that unites all chapulín together is their actions, their locomotion, and the sound that they make. And I'm quoting again, and they eat plants. Whatever appeals to them, they eat, cut up, destroy. They hop, support themselves, fly. They fly. They are constantly flying, whirring. The second takeaway that I'd like to have us note here is that at the end of the description for each chapulín category on the Spanish side, it ends with a little brief section that states that these chapulín are edible or that they're eaten. So for example, if we look at the first example on this side, you can see it says suelen las comer. You can see son de comer. So that basically means they are edible or they are eaten. So for every single entry for the different chapulines in the Florentine Codex, the Spanish side notes that that native peoples eat these insects. So if we look at the Nahuatl text, there's only one kind of chapulín that the Nahuatl text notes that's eaten. It's the Yectli chapulín. It's described as edible in Nahuatl, in the Nahuatl language side. It's also described as chili red in color and appears at harvest time, and that's the time where it's appropriate to kind of harvest them and eat them. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that the Spanish think all the chapulín can be eaten and only the Nahuatl only mentions one? In part, it matters because Mesoamericans did consider chapulín an important food source and still do in places like Oaxaca and Chiapas, which a recent trip that I had to Oaxaca can attest to. And so they've eaten them from the ancient past to the present day. Except in extreme circumstances, however, the Spanish associated insect eating with barbarism, lack of civilization, and associated it with indigeneity in this colonial context. So in this takeaway, you have the Spanish sort of clumping all the chapulín together. They're kind of associating it with as an indigenous food, that Indians ate all of them. But you see a much more subtle approach to chapulín identification and distinguishing some chapulín from others as food sources. And I can talk more about food in the Q&A if people are interested. This brief review of a handful of Mesoamerican codices with locust reference show Mesoamericans too possess a sophisticated understanding of the natural world that includes predating the arrival of the Spanish. Aside from sources like codices, and even these are filtered through European compilers like Sahagún for the Florentine Codex, there are few indigenous voices in the sources, however, which speak directly to the extent and operation of Mesoamerican natural history cultures under Spanish colonial rule. How might we use colonial sources recorded in Spanish for purposes of colonialism as evidence for indigenous knowledge? Turning back to the Cabulco case from the late colonial period that I opened my talk with, we see a fundamental disagreement about insect identification between Garcia and the Quiche Maya leaders of Cabulco. And they're actually identified in the sources as Juan Morales, Martín Tus, Jacinto Zap, Mateo Diaz, Antonio Larios, Jacinto Sarpec, and Vicente Yo. For these indigenous leaders, at the heart of the conflict was Garcia's misidentification of the insects as locusts and his refusal to listen to them when the men told Garcia he was wrong. For colonial officials, however, who investigated the conflict, the heart of the matter was not Garcia's reported inability to identify the locusts correctly. He was the expert, after all, and so this was not the question. Instead, colonial officials focus on the acts by tributary Maya that they considered criminal acts. We can infer this because I don't have the exact cover page of the document, but that's what the document, this one page of the document looks like. We can infer this because the cover page titles the document Criminales Veritas 1804, and it was technically a criminal record and filed with criminal records, and that's why the indigenous leaders who kind of opposed the categorization of these insects as chapulín are named, because it's part of a criminal case. And these are filed in an archive along with civil and criminal proceedings against colonial residents for breaking all sorts of laws. The judge wrote in his follow-up report to colonial officials in the capital, quote, "I thought about what would be the most suitable response in light of the excess that has resulted, because the Indians are required to obey. And I gave them time to return to their houses and for everyone to calm down. And then at 4 that afternoon, I ordered all the participants be jailed. They were all noted to be principales, or elites, and lineage heads, and they countercharged, saying that they had all been convinced that the locusts were not true langosta," end quote. The judge proposed a punishment that included jail time and what he called a light penalty of lashes and 2 months working in public works in the capital. Here, a Spanish language document filed under criminal cases seems at first glance to only concern what the Spanish considered indigenous disobedience or refusal to perform required tributary labor of locust killing. But upon further analysis, we can see evidence of conflicts over correctly identifying locusts on the ground, ignoring local knowledges, and that same kind of local knowledges is what they depend on to get word that the locust plagues are coming in and that they need to go fight them. And let me turn to one more case to kind of mix things up a little bit, or to kind of add a little bit of a twist. I'm going to turn to a final archival example, this time where colonial authorities considered a specialized indigenous method for locust killing as potentially useful. In 1801, a man named Don Miguel de Acosta, languishing in Nueva Guatemala's jail, wrote a letter to the city council after he heard rumors that a locust plague threatened the rich agricultural towns in and around the capital. Acosta claimed that in the letter, Acosta claimed that he had discovered a secret botanical method to repel and kill locusts used by the indigenous peoples of Siam, which is now Thailand. Acosta wrote, quote, "I have obtained a secret way that the planted fields can be protected from the ravenous bleakness and fatality caused by the langosta, here called chapulín," end quote. Acosta proposed that if only the city council will release him from jail, he promised to gather the necessary plants and other materials from the surrounding countryside and apply the method himself. He guaranteed success only when the materials were gathered, mixed, and applied by someone familiar with, as he claimed to be, with, quote, "the art and exactitude of what those Indians in Siam do," end quote. In the interest of time, I'd like to investigate 2 key aspects of this complicated set of sources for the remainder of my talk. First, I want to draw your attention to the kind of language and evidence that Acosta used to present his proposal to colonial scientists, political officials who began investigating his claim and taking it seriously, in terms of thinking about what they thought indigenous knowledge was as a category or as a body of knowledge, and the language that they used to assess its potential value. First, we see Acosta characterizing indigenous knowledge that he had access to as secret, as something static, as something that has to be uncovered. We see this idea of secret knowledge, especially in colonial medicine that I've worked in and that Pablo's worked in, I know as well. You see this language of this knowledge being secret that has to be uncovered by a Spaniard or by some special relationship. And because Acosta is the only one who has access to this secret indigenous knowledge, this makes him the one who can and must apply the method. The subtext is that there is some kind of specialized knowledge in this indigenous method that must be gained from native peoples but can't be easily taught to others. Acosta makes this clear to his readers when he writes, quote, "The Indians of the kingdom of Siam in the Indies in part gave birth to the method that I offer to you. Their sown fields provide the materials needed. These plants are also grown here and have the same features so that I know how to recognize them and correctly harvest them, even though there is some difference in the names that they are known by in Siamese," end quote. The secret indigenous knowledge of Siamese locust killing method, knowing what the plants are called by the indigenous peoples of Siam, knowing their New World cognates and how to recognize them in the landscape in and around the capital of Guatemala, he grants himself the status of expert, not unlike the locust killing expert Garcia in the first example. Additionally, I wish to highlight how Acosta and colonial officials discussed and justified using a secret indigenous locust repelling killing method. We know that Acosta is self-interested. He was in jail in the capital for an undisclosed crime, and surely he would have liked to have been released. This is an audacious strategy to dangle the possibility of a secret, exotic, indigenous, quote-unquote, cure, they use the term remedio, for locust plagues to the city council to get out of jail. The letter also shows that Acosta drew explicitly on the language of humanitarianism as a motivating force, maybe to temper that self-interest a bit, for sharing this sort of humanitarian desire to share his secret indigenous knowledge for the helping of all of humanity. For example, Acosta writes, quote, "My natural love for humanity drives me to wish for its preservation and exterminate all that can threaten humans, even given my unfortunate situation of being imprisoned." This language of humanitarianism echoed discussions of and justifications for the applications of new medical innovations at the time to colonial populations. The first state-directed public health campaigns in colonial Guatemala against typhus, smallpox, and measles were concurrent with professionalizing state-directed locust extermination campaigns. So it's not surprising then to see that language in this context as well. And also we note that locust plagues are called plaga de langosta, plagues, right? So we see that language of illness. Additionally, Acosta associates locusts with biblical references that his readers would have been familiar with and tries to work it into a Christian worldview. And he writes, "Locust plagues are one of the three greatest horrors with which God has punished the world, and that only in heaven can one find a remedio, a cure. But also we know that to stop other similar miseries, God has provided material or natural things according to his sacred plan, that there are natural methods, medios naturales, and the use of them is an absolute miracle." This is also a way to make the argument that this indigenous Siamese method is a quote-unquote miracle and so should not be dismissed as sorcery or misguided folk belief of native peoples or rustic rural folk or anything like that. Finally, he compares what he is doing, the sort of method of combining botanical plants with herbs and other materials in the Siamese recipe and making it into a locust-killing recipe. He compares this to the methodologies of experimentation used by the world's most enlightened scientists. He writes, "Many luces, lights," and referring to enlightened men, "many luces have used the physics of combinable ingredients to the same end as has affirmed these learned men, profesores, to kill locusts." With these three things, constructing himself as an expert with specialized knowledge from what he called the Indians of Siam, attributing to the method a religious justification as miraculous, and comparing the methodology of mixing these botanical ingredients together and testing it to aid in locust extermination. In a way, he's also stripping the method of its indigeneity, or maybe perhaps even better put, legitimates the knowledge despite its purported indigenous origins. So just a way of wrapping up and maybe starting further conversation, what I've begun to show here is that we can identify Mesoamerican knowledges of insects in the natural world and the legacies of that knowledge and how they operate in the colonial period, but that we should not think of this as a static knowledge from some pre-Hispanic time immemorial, but instead as always dynamic, adjusted, revised, experimented with in response to change over time in landscape and multi-species ecologies. There's not one Mesoamerican indigenous knowledge, but many varying in time and space. Nor should we think of indigenous knowledge as something that's separate from other knowledges, but instead always relational, always in conversation with other local knowledges, colonial, enlightenment, and other ethnic groups, African and Asian, for example, and that change over time through the colonial period, as well as through lived experiences in regions that are experiencing things like repeated locust plagues. These in turn shape basic assumptions about historical relationships among people, plants, insects, and colonial landscapes. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you both for such fascinating papers. I'll ask one question and then open to the audience. I was hoping that both of you could reflect on Daniela's concept brought in from history of science of the boundary object and how that might, how you might use that in applying it to your understandings of, or your research on Asian, African, and indigenous knowledges, especially in general medicinal knowledge.
Okay, I can go. So, as I think I mentioned in my talk, this is a concept that I think is extremely useful. Is something that I have used in my own research, specifically thinking about materia medica, medicinal substances in the Caribbean function as such, right? I call them impish objects or strategic objects that are strategic, that are kind of circulated, that are imbued with meaning. But that they preserve a central space, right, in these communities, both in the New World, as it was the case also in Europe. They circulate, but when they circulate, they are vessels, right, for different kind of power. And the same thing can be said about power objects, right, more generally. Power objects that also are used for those very specific purposes and imbued with different meanings, but they retain precisely that characteristic, right? Like, and that's what I was making emphasis, right, on the centrality of both process, the process through which they are created, the materiality, the space in which they are deployed, the purposes for which they are deployed. So they function and they have very specific functions, right? But the malleability and the ability for them to be deployed in different spaces is central, right? Like, and this goes back to the point that not everything and not they function in very specific ways. So.
I'll just add, I didn't get a chance to talk about this a lot in this talk, but one of the things to think about is locusts in particular as interesting I wouldn't say objects, but ways to think through things, because locusts are simultaneously natural and supernatural beings. These are, I didn't get a chance to talk about, I talked about sort of material responses to their infestations, but I didn't get a chance to talk about the really complicated religious aspects of that, especially through lived experiences in colonial life. So, for example, some of the sort of supernatural strategies in order to repel or kill locusts include obviously religious processions. There are a number of saints that are local saints to specific towns that are known as having specific locust killing abilities that will be carried through during these. There are exorcisms of locusts who have landed in particular fields where priests go out and conduct exorcisms as if they were conducting an exorcism of a human to take devils out of their bodies. You also see church-sponsored events where holy wafers stamped with these locust-killing saints would be buried in the around people's fields as a sort of supernatural barrier to these insects. So you have these. I'm not going to be able to elaborate on it too much here, but just this idea that locusts have this kind of, they eat human food, so they're kind of human-like, but they also eat lucrative export crops like indigo and cacao and things like that. So they don't really respect a lot of the boundaries of human, animal, natural, supernatural. And in some ways that makes them quite interesting.
Thank you. Daniela. And then first and second.
Thank you. Because I think in a way, Martha, what you were just, sorry, you can't hear. In a way, Martha, what you were just saying is straight in connection to the point that Pablo was making about how these things are not stable and they are understood as operating within, a web of meanings associations that are, that don't correspond to our concerns. And so in a way, I guess the question I wanted to make, or the point, what I wanted to ask you guys is about sort of, sorry, I am so tired. I don't know if I can phrase it as a question. Pablo, the point you were making about radical alterity, I think that which I very much appreciate, and I think that you are sort of presenting things that you find problematic and working through a potential solution, and I would love to hear more about what you imagine that would look like. But the problem with the radical alterity, which I entirely take, I think it's very helpful what you're saying. It's created at a certain point for certain purposes, and we cannot take it as something that exists and that is always true. The main problem for me with it is that it is sort of unevenly distributed, because the difference is constructed only as indigenous, non-indigenous, or as European other, whereas what Martha is saying is clearly pointing that people from the 16th century are fundamentally operating in categories and ways and systems of beliefs that are very, very other to ours, whoever they may so be. And that the alterity has been imagined as only inhabited by some people, but actually that time is the great divider, and that the alterity is inhabited by everyone. So I guess to try to turn this into a question for Pablo would be, what do you, what is the solution, or how you imagine what you are proposing? And for Martha, I feel that you did so beautifully you made so beautifully the point that locusts are things to think with, and that they are about religion, about political power, about social structure, that at the end I wasn't sure what is a question you want to answer through them about knowledge and the natural world.
So yes, I mean, this is one of the big problems has been, I mean, and again, that's what I started with the Caribbean, and specifically with the sense of that other that disappears, that you can deploy it as pristine, right? As a way of contrasting your own intellectual project. That this is something that is crucial in the birth, again, of historicism, natural history, and later in the creation of the fields that inform our own ways of accessing this knowledge, including anthropology, right? But that leaves very little space for some of the historical actors that are popular in the historical space in which I am working, right? And there's something that comes out of my reflection, for instance, of histories of the African diaspora in the Caribbean, that, as it is the case with the Amerindian, right, they privilege certain specific ways of looking at those spaces that refer to the 18th and 19th century. But throughout the 16th and 17th century, most of these spaces are already populated by people of African descent, many of them Africans, right? But that Creole, that Criollo tradition, as you're saying, it doesn't have, it cannot be so easily located, right, within these boundaries, right, that are identifiable either as the other that has this ontological, either Nahuatl or Yoruba or Sape tradition, right? So that criollo disappears, and it is not there. How do you engage with that? How do you? These are people that are populating and making these spaces that are creating knowledge. How do you engage with that? And for me, as I mentioned, and this is something that I did in my work, in my first book, but I'm something that I'm engaging now. I'm pushing into focusing precisely on not only how they model that experience, but also in what they're creating. What are the purposes of what they're doing, and how is that they value, not necessarily in the same ways that we do, paying attention to what is at stake for them in specific instances, and more importantly, being very conscious about the limitations of what are the claims that we can make. And as a historian of science and medicine, that's important, right? When we're thinking about, it's different to talk about politics than it is to talk about specific instances of knowledge creation and making claims about epistemology. So I think that making that distinction is also crucial here in terms of how do we deal with these histories. But again, just to emphasize what I said, I think focusing again on that material history, on that history of not necessarily of semiotics, but of creativity, of experience, I think it is a way forward, and I think a useful one. Not only, again, for these histories of the others, a term that has been even reified by the global histories, as I said before, but even to think about the spaces in which
Western science, with a big S now, as emerges in the 19th century, what they're, and this is something that historians of science has been doing for a while now, but I think it is less reflected upon when you are trying to incorporate those other histories. Finally, just a quick point is that there are concepts that come right from those epistemologies and from those examinations that can also inform, right, like how we talk about histories of science, which is what I'm most interested in. Not only how do we incorporate it as another, but how can really break down the categories that we use.
And I guess one of the questions I'm asking and trying to think about over sort of a longue durée is thinking about how people's relations with insects, and especially locusts in this consideration, get constructed into a solo category of pest. And I wasn't really able to talk about this a lot, but one of the things I've been tracing is the frequency and duration of locust infestations that begin to intensify in the second half of the 17th century through the 18th century, where they begin to have these state-directed campaigns. And it's much easier to uncover the European aspect of it, which the response is extermination. And that really is kind of what's driving where they show up in the record. It drives up, so it shows up in these kind of locust-killing campaigns. It also shows up in indigenous communities that are asking for tribute relief in cases of locust infestations. And so I also want to, as I continue to work through ideas about food and try to get more at Mesoamerican, supernatural or religious or other kinds of relationships that they have with insects and locusts to kind of counter this kind of collapsing of grasshoppers or chapulín just into pests, but as trying to think about their other ways of thinking how people thought about those animals, maybe also in a productive way, and then what happens in the sense of where you have these continual crises of not only chapulín plagues becoming larger, but covering more geographic space in the same plague and then happening in consecutive years, and how people deal with that as a kind of real environmental problem. Go ahead.
Thank you for wonderful presentations in this session and the last session. I'm not a historian, so I would like to make an observation from outside history. I'm a philosopher of science. And I'd like to note that there's a kind of post-positivist struggle going on in many of these discussions, which involves resisting not only positivism, but the easy alternative to it, which is a kind of complete relativism and so forth. And part of the problem is there's a set of words that we can't help using because they're in the title. Knowledge, epistemology, objects, and interpretations. And these words lead us back into positivism in some horribly frustrating way. And yet, you're all going for something else. And I'd like to point out that, for example, in philosophy, this issue it has been raised in many ways, but certainly one important one was by Ian Hacking in his book, Representing and Intervening, in which he insisted that the philosophers, had too much focused on representation, that is, on science's theory in some way, and that what was much more important to revalue was on practice, scientific intervention in the world. And I hear you going for that all the time. In anthropology, of course, as one of the speakers referred to, the ontological turn has tried to make that post-positivist move with Viveros de Castro and a lot of other people. And it can go into a totally relativist restoration of indigenous knowledge as this separate thing that's the opposite of modern science and so forth. But there are also readings of that don't do that. And I don't have any solution except to say, I forget who said this originally, but problems with modernity cannot be solved with the concepts of modernity. That is, that there's no good answer to these struggles except to keep struggling as you each are, to get out of both the positivist move and the simplistic anti-positivist move into another world. But we can't get there in the world we live in, because we live in the modern world. It's not easy to get there. The way if I was running this conference, I would call it Indigenous Worlds and the Making of Colonial Europe. Indigenous Latin American Worlds and the Making of Modern Europe, because I think that's what you're talking about. And so I just want to wish you a lot of luck. They're terrible problems.
Absolutely. I just want to say something. I mean, this is a very well-known critique, for instance, of the ontological term, right? That the slippage between and the very easy uses and sometimes problematic of terms like ontology, epistemology, semiotics, how they're confused and how they're. I think that you are very right, and this is one of the things that I was trying to point out, right? Like the categories, our own fields, right? Like the structures around which we are talking, they're formed by these historical events. It's a historical event also, we have to remember. They emerge from a specific historical process and models. That's what I was also talking about, like how we can use different languages, right? How can we use not only in terms of languages, but different words, as you say. Although when we think about worlds, it's kind of always going back to that kind of like word ontology. It's very easy to go back to that, but your point is well taken.
Another question right here.
Should I go first or?
Oh goodness, were you first? Oh, go ahead in the back, and then second
Okay.
here. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for this amazing session. I actually had a question for Dr. Few. And on the Florentine Codex and the images of, the now what section that has the 3 images versus the Spanish that has, the 1 image, you were talking about how the eating of insects, for example, could represent another way that indigeneity was seen as, savage. So I'm wondering what other types of, exotic animals and insects kind of come into this, food gastronomical framework, because I'm thinking about, of course, the famous iguana drawing, by Fernández de Oviedo, and the way that iguana meat is described as, still very tasty. So is there specifically a type of difference between, do you see any kind of categorical differences between, insects and animals in the ways that they're represented, both, in the now what text and, this could be the Florentine Codex or some of the other documents that you're looking at?
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's really interesting. I have to admit, I'm still kind of working through the insect sections of the natural things. So that's going to take a little while longer, but I have been thinking about ant and ant larvae, beetles, water bugs, all these kinds of things that are noted in the colonial period documents and other sources as well that are food items. And there's been this whole kind of re-interest in insects as food and protein in terms of thinking about our world today. So there's been a lot of work recently among many different scholars on this topic. So that's motivating me a little bit there. To just kind of keep it to Locusts really quickly, or Chapulín, there's one of the things that I wasn't able to talk about in the talk, but that comes up in the sources, is that there's a suspicion that, people are noting that in colonial records during Chapulín plagues that native peoples eat it, and they're wondering whether the harvesting and eating of Chapulín as a food source is helping to cause the increase in locust plagues and infestations, and sort of seeing that as a problem. And so there are a number of local laws that are promulgated as a way to kind of penalize through jail time and physical punishment people eating Chapulín. So I would like to do more of that. Right now I only have a few scattered sources of these, and I'm hoping that some research research that I've just completed. As I go through the materials, I'll be able to find more examples. The other thing that I find interesting with Chapulín in particular, I mentioned that people's domestic animals were often, especially indigenous communities, domestic animals were brought to fields where Chapulín egg sacs have been found. And the idea is that you could trample the egg sacs, but a lot of it was the turkeys and pigs and other animals could eat the locust egg sacs, because pigs in particular could dig, turkeys can dig things up, chickens could dig things up. And there's all this mention that animals and birds who have fed on locust egg sacs taste really good. So there's a number of references to that. So Spaniards are eating locusts, but through their domestic animals. And so I haven't really played around with that yet, but I'm hoping to think a little bit more about that.
So jamón de chapulín, more or less.
Yeah.
All right, we'll have this question and then one more.
Okay, my question is for Mr. Gómez. Okay, I came in late, but I really enjoy what you was talking about the Caribbean. And my question is like, Caribbean history is very, and indigenous history in the Caribbean is very strong. When you connect Africa, especially Venezuela, most of the people don't understand, like, I'm from the Caribbean, and I look black, but I know I'm indigenous because I understand I am a Colonial because my family migrated from the Orinoco River. But what I would like to know, how can we get proper representation in academia to tell our story? Because I print to see when we tell an indigenous story, they expect to see us with a feather in our head or looking a certain way. But we come in different shades. And my thing is, within the indigenous story, the darker people of the indigenous, their story get lost. So how can we, expose their story? Because I know it's more than just, in the Caribbean, we have different shades of, like my culture is rich. I understand, like my son, I always tell my son, know that we're not black. Black is the color. Know that you're indigenous. Know you're a Colonial. You're not even like if you call a person from the Colonial person a Carib Indian, that's an insult, It's like, so my thing is, how can we change the dynamics,
Absolutely. Thank you for the comment. I think that it is true. The Caribbean, I think, offers precisely what you're saying. It is a space of dynamism. It's a place of interconnection. It's a place that has been defined precisely by that. But it's not a place of erasure. It's a place of creativity. It is not that the Caribbean is unique in this sense, but precisely because of the configuration, the ways in which Caribbean societies emerge out of this maelstrom, it allows to see dynamics that are common in other spaces. And I've said these elsewhere, but they actually point out to exactly what you're saying, that the problems of thinking with these categories and to have these really stereotypes about what we have to expect when we are thinking about histories of interaction, of exchange, of science or medicine, because the Caribbean actually kind of they become, I'm thinking here of the word people like Trudeau, right? Like they have discussed precisely that fragmentation as a powerful tool rather than as a tool of dissolution, right? And I started the talk precisely with this, right? That is how the Caribbean functions, right? A story of disappearance, but it is on the contrary, right? It signals precisely the kind of processes that makes these sort of questions powerful and empirically sound, right? Like, so it also is a question of methodology. So I really appreciate the comment.
All right, we'll have time for one more question.
Hi, this is a question for Pablo Gómez. I'm curious of how you are treating in your concept of radical alterity the souls that many indigenous people refer until these days in illnesses such as susto, or and in which they refer to lose their soul, and that in the ethnographies have been referred as from 1 to up to 20, depending on the Nahua group even that is studied.
I'm sorry, I did not understand the question. It has to do with my hearing, so if you could, please.
How these souls that the indigenous people refer in ethnography how are they treated in your concept of radical alterity?
Soul?
Souls, yeah.
Souls. How do we deal with the spiritual world? Is that
is it treated in your concept of radical alterity?
well? I mean, I'm kind of arguing against this idea of radical authority, but I'm using right. I think this goes back to some of the respect that one has to have for one's historical actors and the word and how the tools that they're deploying into the creation of ritual practices. In many of the cases that I study, ritual practitioners do not have that differentiation between the natural world and the spiritual world. They form part of it, and they said it, and they explain it, and even when it is incongruent, right? These are the tools that they are using for precisely the sort of material process in which we're interested. So they belong very much so. Those differences are part of what we were discussing before, categories that are being created at the same time of differentiation. And this is something that is at the center for, again, something like Philippe Descola has been arguing, right, in terms of that differentiation between nature and culture, spiritual world and nature, and the West and the others, that is very problematic precisely because of the reason that we discussed. So, no, they're very much inserted. I mean, in this case, and this goes back to the comment that was made before, it is not only within our categories, but that those actors, all of them, Europeans included, not only Native Americans, Europeans, people of African descent, they conceive of that spiritual world as being immanent in their own spaces. This is not something that it is separated.
All right. Thank you very much to our panelists, and we'll break for lunch.